Goeiemôre en welkom by vanmiddag se nasie in gesprek bespreking. Ek is François de Kok en ek is van Senwes. Vanmiddag se en ook welkom aan almal wat aanlyn volg. Vanmiddag se bespreking gaan oor water. Nou Suid-Afrika is 'n waterskaars land. Jy sal dit nie sê as jy na Nampo toe ry en jy sien dit het 'n week gelede soos 'n dam hier gelyk nie. Maar dit is 'n waterskaars land en ons is in 'n landbouindustrie en die behoefte en die verdeling van water en die toekenning van water tussen industrie is wat ek vanmiddag van die paneel wil hoor. Landbou gebruik baie water, maar so ook nywerheid en so ook vir menslike gebruik. So is ons infrastruktuur problematies. So ek sien uit daarna om na die paneel vanmiddag te luister. Hier's 'n kort insetsel.
Water has always been a limiting factor in South African agriculture, but today that pressure is intensifying. Rainfall is becoming less predictable, demand is increasing, and every drop is being asked to go further. Agriculture is no longer the only major user of water. Cities are expanding, industry is growing, and environmental systems require protection, which means water is no longer just a resource, it's a shared constraint, and increasingly, a point of competition.
We do have a constrained water resource situation at this point in time. We need to remember that South Africa is a water-scarce country. We do have an arid to semi-arid climate, but if you look at our water demands overall, we are seeing an increased demand, mostly because of rural areas coming online with water resources, but mostly because our metropolitan areas are increasing and expanding quite rapidly. When we look at the percentage of water that agriculture uses, it is the biggest water user, above 60%. When also looking at the other side, industrial water demand is also increasing, but agriculture is the biggest water consumer at this point in time. When we look at the stresses that climate brings, at this point in time, we have been experiencing above average rain for the past 2 years, but what we are going to see now is we are moving into El Nino. It's not as certain yet, but that will mean that we will have below average rainfall. It is going to become more complex in future due to the impacts of climate change on various areas, whether it be the climate, whether it be your availability of water resources, and even your soil. I think we need to focus on pollution, just the awareness of it, because especially with the Green Drop report that was released, over 500,000 litres per day of sewage getting pumped into rivers, that affects farmers. And then obviously we also have to look at our water demand, which means that because agriculture is using a lot more water than the other sectors, they are going to look at agriculture first to try and become more water efficient and reduce their overall water use and demand.
For agriculture, the implications are significant. Water availability directly affects production, crop choices, and long-term investment decisions. And in a constrained system, access to water is not guaranteed, which raises difficult questions about who gets water, when, and at what cost. Water allocation in South Africa is governed by policy, licensing, and infrastructure systems. But in practice, the picture is more complex. Aging infrastructure, maintenance backlogs, and uneven management capacity all affect how water is stored, distributed, and accessed, meaning that availability is not just about supply, but about how effectively the system functions.
Watersekerheid is 'n baie belangrike deel vir die boer. As water beskikbaarheid onseker raak, kan 'n mens nie met sekerheid beplan wat jy gaan plant nie. En 'n mens raak meer konservatief in wat jy doen, en dit veroorsaak dat 'n mens minder plant. En jy moet seker wees van die feit dat jy jou oes kan afhaal met sukses. Die impak daarvan in Suid-Afrika sal wees dat boere minder plant en op die einde van die dag kospryse sal toeneem en werkbeskikbaarheid sal ook afneem. Ons gebruik baie water in die landbou, veral in groenteproduksies, en as 'n mens swak waterkwaliteit het, het dit 'n direkte impak op mense plante se gesondheid. Net soos ons as mens gesonde kos nodig het, het plante gesonde water nodig. En as waterkwaliteit sleg is, gaan dit 'n impak hê op die plante se gesondheid. Pestdruk sal toeneem, boere moet meer spuit en op die einde van die dag is die gesondheid van die mense ook geaffekteer daardeur.
And yet, across the sector, farmers are adapting, improving irrigation efficiency, investing in technology, and using data to make better decisions. But efficiency alone cannot solve a systemic constraint, especially when demand continues to grow. Because at its core, this is not just a technical issue, it's a question of balance between agriculture and urban demand, between economic growth and environmental sustainability, between equity and productivity. So what does effective and fair water allocation look like in a water-constrained South Africa? And how do we ensure that agriculture remains viable while sharing a resource that is becoming increasingly scarce? When every drop counts, who decides where it goes? Welcome to the conversation.
A hearty welcome to our audience this afternoon. As we discuss the water issue, has been very well introduced to us. The contestation of water in South Africa. South Africa is a water scarce country. Water security obviously being paramount in how we manage our scarce resources. Also online to our viewers, welcome. We hope you enjoy this discussion. We have an eminently distinguished panel who are all involved in the water policy, legislation, management areas over many years, and welcome to our panel. I'm going to introduce them briefly to you so that you know that they are top guys in the water industry and have the experience to really tackle this subject with the necessary insight and the necessary experience. And I'm going to start with Professor Mike Miller, who I've known for many years. He is with the Wits School of Governance. He's an adjunct professor, and Mike is still very much in the academic field, still publishing, very much advising on areas of water as a strategic public benefit, and also in development management. Mike has not just have local experience, he has extensive global experience as well, and we're going to tap into that global experience. He has, amongst others, chaired the World Economic Forum Global Agenda Council on Water Security on a global scale, so he can also relate to what's happening in the rest of the world, and we have to take cognizance of that. He was the DG of the Department of Water and Forestry from 1997 to 2005. He's a professional registered engineer, and he has published extensively academically on these issues. Welcome, Mike. Good to have you here. Then next to Mike is Theo Boshoff. He formerly of Agri-SA and then joined Agbus. I think I appointed him in 2017. And he was head of legal intelligence services and became my successor there at Agbus since January 2022. And Theo has extensive experience in engaging with government on water legislation, etc. Also on many others. Theo has, interesting, he got a LLB cum laude from Pretoria University and 2 master's degrees, one in wildlife management, the other one in constitutional law from Potch University under now Judge Elmine du Plessis, if I remember correctly. Yeah, so Theo has a great legal background, legal training. He has, as I said, extensive experience in the water policy and legislation environment. Then to Jan Serabe, who I've also been privileged to know for a long time. He's an environmental law specialist attorney and a legal and policy contractor. He used to be with Agri-SA full-time for 9 years, more or less, as head of national resources. Since August 2025, he's been independent, but still contracting also to Agri-SA. He was a part-time commissioner of the Presidential Climate Commission, an LLB from Pretoria University, and an LLM in Marine and Environmental Law from UCT. And then to my left is Greg Smith. Greg is the CEO of the South African Association for Water User Associations. It's quite a long acronym, so for WUA or something like that. Greg, but great to have you here. I worked for many years with Nick Kunze, who was your predecessor, and many of you who have been in the water industry will remember Nick well. So Greg, great to have you here. You also have extensive experience, also previously with Agri-SA in the water environment, where I'm sure you worked with Janse. Okay, so, and you have an honours in environmental and water science from the University of the Western Cape. And obviously you're going to bring us a perspective from the water users, particularly their concerns, etc. Right. As was correctly stated in the intro, the water issue in South Africa is a burning issue. We are a water scarce country generally. It's ironic that we're going to talk about water when we've just had massive floods, 2 massive floods in the Limpopo province and in the northern areas this year, and then we've had a very dry or a very wet pre-season in the maize belt, and then a dry season, and then a very wet season again, perhaps a midsommerdroogte, as they call it. And we still see the evidence of that around us. And then in the Western Cape, and I was there, I've just experienced it, massive floods, something that I didn't believe possible. Even in the Longkloof, a place called Krakeel, over 1,000 millimeters of rain within about 24 hours. It's mind-boggling to think how much water is 1,000 millimeters. It's a meter of water, basically. And the damage that just caused. The damage is extensive. We must recognize that. But it's also all part of infrastructure and how we manage both the extremes of water, the floods and the droughts in this country. Because in all probability, we are seeing the effects of climate change establishing themselves through more extreme weather events. And how do we manage our resources in this environment? So I think it's important that we start firstly with the basics. What does our constitution say about water, and what are the acts that regulate water? And I want to ask Janse to introduce that to us. And to just give us a bit of background, just to frame first, what is the policy and the legislation environment look like? And then we're going to delve into all the other issues. But there's one thing that I neglected to say, and I think we can give him a hand. Janse has just been appointed by Cabinet to the National Water Infrastructure Agency. And I think that it is great to have somebody of your stature in that water infrastructure agency, because I think infrastructure is going to be a massive issue going forward in the whole water debate. And we need a voice there that understands how agriculture also works with water. So let's just give him a hand. Okay, but over to you. Let's just get a background on the imperative for water management, etc., from the Constitution and the 2 Water Acts specifically.
Yes, John, there's an extensive legal landscape that a person needs to consider when you look at water governance and everything that's happening as we speak in the water space. I think the introduction was very clear about the fact that it's a resource which is under stress, but it's not only technical stress. You know, it's a politically and socially contested area. And that's why it's so important to understand where the constitutional framework fits in, or where water governance fits into the constitutional framework. And also within this competition narrative that we often find ourselves in as agriculture when it comes to water particularly, that we understand what that landscape is about. So starting from basics, the Constitution is the supreme law of the country, and law and conduct that is inconsistent with it by its wording is illegitimate. It's something that our Constitution protects very clearly. Now, our Constitution has these particular rights, fundamental human rights, that are almost sacrosanct in the way that they've been drafted. And they include, for instance, the right to sufficient access to water and food, which is probably the one that Agri-SA or agriculture in South Africa is focused on, you know, from a principal point of view. But it also has this right to food security as well, as an addition to almost the right to dignity, which is formally enshrined as such. Together with that, and it's a whole series of rights, go the right to an environment that's not harmful to health and well-being, and to have that environment protected through legislative and other processes, and then also, very importantly, the right to just administrative action, which is where government, particularly in the context of water governance, needs to step very carefully as far as its administrative responsibilities and the right of every citizen in the country to just administrative action. So from a constitutional point of view, everything needs to be measured against the Constitution, and particularly the Bill of Rights. I'm not going to go into the detail too much, but for instance, the governance is specifically also regulated in terms of the Constitution, whereby water as a national resource falls with national government. And that's a very important element as well. Similar to the police service, it's not something that is governed at provincial or local level, although the implementation takes place there. But very importantly, as far as the legislative and the governance context, the preeminence of the National Department of Water and Sanitation, also prescribed by the Constitution. Then as far as discrete legislation or specific legislation is concerned, we have a National Water Act, which was created in 1998 and abolished a whole series. In fact, the Act says it contains an entire schedule of acts that were repealed by the National Water Act. And this National Water Act was groundbreaking. I'm a big fan of this act, through studies and through the implementation and through working with it for a number of years, understanding the beauty of this piece of legislation. The one fundamental change that it brought about in South Africa is that it said that as opposed to previous pieces of legislation that made water very closely attached to land by riparian owners, people living adjacent to rivers, that act actually in 1998 moved away from it altogether. And it was well ahead of its time, 25 years ahead of what global consensus about water governance is concerned now. But it established that water belongs, and it confirmed that water belongs to everyone in South Africa, with government being the custodian of it through the Minister of Water and Sanitation. It consolidated all these things about how water can be used, what is lawful water use, what happens to old order water rights, existing lawful water uses, when are licenses necessary. And it's a codification essentially of what our water resource governance is all about. Together with that, we have a Water Services Act, which regulates how water services are concerned. And those water services are the ones that have been in the news in recent times, particularly with Johannesburg's water crisis. As far as water service delivery is concerned, that's the water that comes from people's taps. So I think that in a nutshell, I think there's probably a bit more. And then it must also be said, the courts also have an important role to play in this. And there's been a case law, particularly from the Supreme Court of Appeal and in matters that Agri-SA was particularly involved in, about allocation of water. And saying how you determine how water is allocated, what are the requirements to be considered from an administrative point of view, again, when issuing water use licenses. And that, in a nutshell, is the legal landscape where a person sits with water governance in South Africa. A long answer, John, but I think that more or less in a nutshell.
Perfect. Great. We're going to touch on a number of those points again. Thanks very much, Janse. Professor Miller, we had a chance to chat about this last night too, and your experience globally. How does our water management system compare to best practice globally? And are we on the right track? You also mentioned that the water space, if I can call it that, is a slow-moving space generally. There haven't been massive drastic changes, but things evolve, I would nearly say, even moving from the existing lawful use to water licenses, etc. How do you see, and from a global perspective, where are there trends that we should be changing and what we should be looking at? Also from an agricultural point of view. Within your National Planning Commission work, the message that we got from for agriculture was that there's going to be no new allocation of water for agriculture, but there were one or two exceptions, but generally speaking. So it actually falls to agriculture that we have to be more efficient in our water use. And manage it better, and is the capability there for our users to manage it better? Perhaps your perspective.
Okay, thanks for that. I mean, I think the first thing to say is that Water is not the same everywhere, and that's why it becomes quite difficult to manage. So even inside South Africa, yeah, you've got a little bit of extra water in the Western Cape at the moment. I'm sure there's parts of South Africa where people haven't seen all the rain that we've been talking about, and next season it's going to be different. And across the world, it's the same thing as well. Everywhere has different issues, and many countries are grappling with how best to organize the water. And one of the things that we're finding, firstly, of course, and South Africa knows this well, is that water is very variable. You have good years, you have bad years. It's not like electricity. You just throw some more coal in the power station, or not allowed to say that. You put some more gas in the power station, you can do that for another 10 years, and then you'll have power. Water, you look up into the sky and you hope it's going to rain, and you prepare yourself that it might rain more, it might rain less. And that happens all over the world. What you do find, and I find the United States very useful about this, because when we were writing the National Water Act back in the 1990s, a long time ago, we got some of the best lawyers in the world to come and give us some advice. And the best advice we got was from an American environmental lawyer, a very famous lawyer, Joseph Sachs, who said to us, you know, we can teach you a lot from America. We can give you 50 different ways to manage water that are wrong, because in America, every state has its own water law. And he says, firstly, don't do that kind of mistake. Don't have different laws in different regions covering the same river. But then he also pointed out that some of the mistakes that they've made have been really terrible. And one of the mistakes they've made, and it's a very important one for South Africa in a time of climate change, they said, first come, first served. If you got to that place on the top of the hill first and you built a dam, that water's yours, and the people down will have to use what you have left. Now, what that meant afterwards, and we've seen this, particularly in the Midwests and the Southwest of USA, Colorado and down into Texas and those places, you see those rivers running dry because everyone got allocated the water at a time when there was a lot of water. And now there's less water. And the people upstream are saying, no, but this is our water. Don't complain to us if we don't let the water down, because we were here first and we're using it. And downstream people are saying, how do we get water to our cities? And the dams in the big river systems of Colorado and downstream are running empty. And they're really getting very worried about it. And one of the things that they're saying is, we've got to come together and organize how we use this water better. But we can't change the law, because the law has given these water rights to the people upstream, and we can't change those because they'll want compensation. And you look at this and you say, well, how are the Americans solving this problem? And with apologies to those with legal qualifications here, what they've done is they've got lawyers together to come and try and sort out this mess. They're not getting engineers to solve the water problem. They're getting lawyers together. And the lawyers are all saying, our client says, this is their water. We're not going to talk to you about what happens to our water. That's your problem. And I think what we see in the States is the danger of thinking that water is something fixed, that you allocate once and then it belongs to you and it's a property right. And that's what we changed in 1998 with the National Water Act. Water is no longer a right as in a property, but people have a right to use it. And once it's been allocated to use, that use is protected. But it's the use of the water that's protected, not the water itself. So I think that from the United States, we got this wonderful lesson. First of all, don't do what we did, but I always like people who can say that. And secondly, they said, do not make water a permanent right. And when we look now all over the world at what's happening with climate change, where suddenly the amount of water available is not quite the same as it used to be, it's much more helpful to the society as a whole to say, okay, we've got less water than we used to have, how are we going to share it? Or perhaps we've got more water than we used to have, what can we do extra with it? And I think what you're seeing across the world is everyone adjusting the way they manage their water, firstly, to get away from this private right issue. And I've seen the Chileans are having a lot of arguments about that because their laws have been going backwards and forwards with their governments going backwards and forwards. But if you concentrate on what people are doing with water and using it well, then you have a good discussion in the society. Then you have a discussion about what's best for society. Can we use it this way? Can we use it the other way? Can we cooperate? You know, can city wastewater be treated and used in agriculture, for instance? And you begin to have productive discussions rather than fights about property. And I think that's a trend that we're going to see more of globally as climate change suddenly takes the certainty, this is my water, it's always going to be here and it's always going to be mine. When that certainty goes, you've got to find new ways to work with the water you have. And I think that's something that's happening internationally. And you can speak to the Australians about it as well. The Australians have really also learned some very hard lessons about, oh, it's okay if we just behave differently, we'll have enough water. And then suddenly they discovered that even though they behaved differently, they didn't have enough water, and they've started doing a lot of infrastructure development, which they were opposed to, because infrastructure was bad for the environment. So what we're seeing internationally also is much more balance between human use and environmental protection. You can't separate those two out. You've got to manage them together. And it's interesting watching other societies doing that, because funnily enough, our Water Act actually allows us to have those discussions and say, what is the best outcome for our communities, for everyone in the community, with the water we have. At least that's what we hope the legislation encourages.
Thank you very much for that perspective, Mike. Thea, I want to come to you now. I'm a little bit out of the legislation part, but I do know that there's a new amendment bill in the offing, and that there are a number of quite critical issues that are being proposed. Perhaps highlight what's happening in the new legislation phase, and what should we be looking out for? Perhaps what are threats or perceived threats from the agricultural community, and what's the engagement process? When I say engagement process, where do we stand? Has it gone to NEDLAC? Is it in Parliament, or is it still really in a draft form?
Yeah, thank you very much, John. So I think all the basic principles that Prof spoke to, it's incredibly important. What we are seeing now, because it's nearly 30 years since the Act was passed, some of those aspects were, I think, with respect, transitional provisions, or maybe intended to be transitional provisions. And we're at the stage now with the potential amendments. Some of these transitional periods might be phased out, might be moved. So some of the aspects that we are seeing, for instance, is it's the legislative embodiment of the sort of so-called user-to-loser principle, with a stronger centralization of water allocation, and also the criteria that is applied there. And there's been, and I think as Janse mentioned, that there's been a lot of litigation also around how this criteria is applied, and the courts have previously indicated that there must be a fair allocation between how these criteria are applied. I think probably the most important transitional provision is, and you have these inherent, and understand the context, I think quite well, but it's this inherent sort of tension between the need to transform water rights, in the sense that it was nationalized essentially. Water is now a national resource. It needs to be equitably allocated, but at the same time you need security of supply, because you cannot overnight interrupt business practices. And that's where the concept of existing lawful use came from. In other words, so it's not, I don't think it's used anywhere in the legislation to say the word transitional, but I think it's understood that it was supposed to be a transitional mechanism, that when we move towards licensing, that can be used as the tool to ensure equitable allocation. I think the challenge is that even though we are 30 years further down the line, we're not as far with the process, I think, as we would have liked to be. So you cannot achieve water allocation whilst retaining all the existing water rights. I think that's an understood process, but at the same time, there's still this threat of business disruption. And I could say that from the primary producers, from Jan's side, of course, that's, I think, a direct threat, but also from the value chain side, there is financing is very much attached to the value of land is very much attached to also the potential for water use. And again, this comes in with the criteria that is being altered, where there was this equitable balance, in the criteria between our national policy imperatives of water reallocation, but at the same time, the realism comes in to say, but the ability to use the water productively. So even though it has been split from your riparian rights and your land rights, it's common sense would dictate that it can never be completely split, because the land with that is able to use water, irrespective of who the owner must be or owner is, will always play a deciding role. So our challenge with the so-called sort of use it to lose it approach, and the way that's come in with the proposals to prohibit the trading of water rights as well, is I think, as was very accurately showed in the video earlier, you have a business imperative to save water, to use water more efficiently. But unfortunately, I think at the moment, and this is one of the challenges that we need to adopt and think creatively in terms of what recommendations we can make, but from a legislative point of view, there's less of an incentive, and I think with the use it to lose it concept coming into the legislation, I dare say that might get even worse in terms of what is your actual incentive to use water productively. And just some of the concepts that we've been thinking about. When water, for instance, is stressed in an area, in a water catchment area, and restrictions are imposed on the different water users, you get the same restrictions whether you're an efficient user or an inefficient user. You don't get greater security of supply whether you're an efficient user. So these are some of the concepts I think counter maybe some of the proposals that we need to consider, because the underlying basis of it I don't think is too disputed, in the sense that we need to reform the water use patterns that we currently have, along with obviously the land ownership patterns. I don't think that's disputed. But if we are to achieve the sort of job creation targets that the NDP set us, agriculture has to achieve 1 million new jobs, and that's very, very much tied. If you look at the commodities that are most labor intensive, that create the most jobs, they are very reliant on irrigation, the likes of the horticultural industry, the sugar industry. So if we are to achieve those targets, we're going to have to, almost through efficiencies, create our own additional water so that we can create additional hectares, so that we can employ more people. There's an infrastructure element of that. There's also application of efficiency. And although we see, and I'm quite confident that the South African sector, are quite well advanced in terms of the world, the technological uptake and how efficient they are, but it's driven very much by business imperatives at the moment, where you need that support from the legislative side as well to incentivize it, opposed to essentially a disincentive to punish anyone that if you don't use your water efficiently, it will be taken away.
Right, thanks, Theo. I think there's one or two aspects that we must just mention here, and I stand to be corrected, but just generally, rule of thumb, agriculture uses 60% of all water in South Africa, and then of that water that's used, roughly 95% is used by white commercial farmers, if I may say so. We know that there are a lot of black commercial farmers coming in. I know the Citrus Growers Association have about 150 black commercial farmers already using water, etc., and there are other industries as well, and it's growing. But also there is a transformative nature probably included in the new legislation. So just to give you a sense of that water use. I think the imperative of water use efficiency is driving it, and that's a business imperative. And that I think the sector has made incredible progress as far as that is concerned. We can elaborate on that just now. I worry about where did you say centralizing allocation? That looks very much top-down, centralized government type of issue. What are the alternatives? So think a bit about that. How are we going to do this allocation if that's going to become a sort of a new norm? How are we going to do it? But I want to go to Greg now. Greg, you sit at the farmer side, the water users. What are they saying? What do they perceive now as their biggest stumbling blocks? How is and I want you to touch on the move from existing lawful use to water licenses. How is that being perceived? How is that progressing? But also the use it or lose it issue, and also the issue of financing and the transfer of so-called water rights, which has been an issue for financing, and then also the water boards versus the water management or catchment management authorities. How is that progressing, and what are the issues around that?
Okay, 100%. I think, when it comes down to the user itself, the most important item for them is the allocation, and having a certain amount of of security in what their allocation is. I know, of course, based on how the Act has been set out, your allocation is not set in stone. So if you go through the process of validation and verification, where you do in fact get a license, there might be changes as things currently stand. I think for a water user, it's important that they know how much water they will be getting, where they will be getting it, and at what tempo they will be getting it, especially if it's a closed system where infrastructure is involved. Secondly, what's very important is, of course, the quality of the water. I think a user is very, very, very keen to keep a close eye on water quality, because it does, in fact, affect the quality of the produce that is produced. It also affects the infrastructure that is used, with infrastructure getting clogged with many different elements in the water. So I think for user, water quality, allocation is very important. And then, of course, the infrastructure that you do use on farm. A lot of farmers have been moving away from flood irrigation more to the drip or the micro drip irrigation, where they are using the water as optimally as possible. I think a farmer always stretches the water as far as possible to produce as much as possible. So we have picked up that there's been a huge shift in that regard. Moving away from the quality, then we also get to the pricing of water. I mean, at the end of the day, it's a very important element, and it contributes quite extensively to your input costs. So at this stage, it's not the biggest part of your input costs, but there is a movement from government to move away from the capping of pricing for agriculture specifically. So that's also something that will end up, impacting the pocket of the producer at the end of the day. And we've seen what happened with diesel prices recently, and all of that is putting further strain on the users at the end of the day. I think for a user, the next thing that's very important is the conveyance system that provides the water to their sluice or to their pump or whatever it might be. I think users are keenly aware of what the infrastructure, what's happening with the infrastructure, what's the current state of the infrastructure, will it be refurbished, is it being operated and maintained efficiently, because all of those things impact on whether they will receive their water at the right place at the right time. So I think users are quite keenly involved in all of these processes, and that's exactly where Water User Association comes in. That's where users come together to pool their resources, to give their time, to manage the water as a collective, because it's their water. There's a saying, everyone lives downstream from someone. So if we manage the water as a collective, we will make sure that everyone gets what they are supposed to get. And then, from an institutional side of things, that's also something that has a great impact on the user. And you mentioned the water boards, the catchment management agencies. So the movement there is that irrigation boards are being transformed into water user associations. There has been quite a lot of strides made in that process, with over 50% of them being transformed. The operationalizing of them is another question. I think that will also take quite a bit of time. In terms of the catchment management agencies, so they are the next level above the water user associations. Basically, water user associations manage water at the local level, so that's very, very smaller. It's let's say in a quaternary catchment, usually is how they are defined. They then manage groundwater, the conveyance system as an example, and perhaps a part of a river in a closed system. Then you have the catchment management agencies that manage water at the catchment level. So that structure has also changed quite a bit in the past years. I think we started out with 19 water management areas. We then moved to 9 water management areas, and we're now in 6 water management areas. So there's been quite a lot of transition taking place there, because when a CMA is established, functions is taken away from the Department of Water and Sanitation. The water management functions are taken away and given to the CMA. So this then requires, a lot of staff to transfer. So those that were fulfilling the role of water management within the department then has to go to the CMA. So of course there's a lot of labor constraints there. Some people are not even willing to move from the one to the other. So there's been growing pains in that regard. But I think there's also been progress. I think the previous minister did establish all of them. I know all of them at this stage has boards. So the last CMA to get boards, I think it was in the past few weeks, was the BOCMA, so the Breda Olifants Catchment Management Agency. So they now have boards. So 2 of those CMAs have been established in the past, so they are functional. But the other 4 is in process of becoming functional due to the transition phase that is currently at play. So I think that those are the 2 institutions that are very important. I think from a water management perspective, there's 3 levels of water management. You have the department or the minister as the custodian at the top level, responsible for national management, catchment, catchment level. So the Department of Water and Sanitation has to develop a national water resource strategy that governs how our water resources are managed throughout the country. Then the Catchment Management Agency has to have a catchment management strategy, how they manage water within the catchment. And then, of course, the Water Users Association or water management plan of how they manage the water in their confined area. So in terms of those developments, there is quite a bit of movement, but there is still growing pains that is having an effect on operationalizing the institutions.
Thanks, Greg. Prof. Mike, I want to come back to you. See, you've been making some notes, so I want you to respond to a couple of things. But I want to get to the contentious issue of high-level water allocation to agriculture, and then obviously on the one side. And agriculture, to my mind, has been very successful in creating jobs. I think we saw yesterday the country lost, I think, 345,000 jobs, but agriculture is up 30,000. And we're just shy of the 1 million jobs that we were targeting for. So we've grown since 2012, when the National Development Plan came out, from roughly 650,000 to very close to 1 million jobs now in agriculture. So yes, there's been job growth, but there's also been the export and the positive trade balance, which is very significant, probably roughly $8 billion worth at the moment. The exports are worth about 15. I'm talking about the positive trade balance. So agriculture has performed, especially the high value products produced under irrigation. So there's a case to be made out that agriculture is using it pretty effectively. Agriculture is also going to say, but look what's happening at the big water boards, and especially at the municipal level, around the wastage of water in towns, metros, etc. Also around infrastructure maintenance, etc. And this creates an unease also from the agricultural sector, because it could have been water used for better purposes. Your thoughts on that? Because you have the macro picture, because you are still involved in advising on a macro situation on this contentious issue of water for agriculture versus water for general development and growth of the country's economy and the health and wealth of the people of South Africa.
Yeah, thanks, John. You know, I used to talk, and I thought we'd try and get the slide up, and we couldn't get that organized. But I always like to remind people that when we're talking about agriculture taking the lion's share of the country's water, it sounds terrible, doesn't it? You know, you're the greedy people who are taking it all. Yeah. And actually, I said, you must be careful about using that. And I say, be honest. Agriculture takes the hyena's share. You take what's left over after the cities, after the industries, after the mines, and then you use what's there. And actually it makes sense like that, because you can't keep water away from people. People come first. You can't keep water away from the really big and productive industries, which, you know, actually produce a lot more money and quite often more jobs per drop of water than agriculture. But agriculture does very well with what's left. And I think that notion is very clear, that agriculture will never get the first priority. And I always use the Commission of Water Affairs that was set up in 1970, which said this: no more water for agriculture. Agriculture must use what they've got, and they must use it well. And I thought, okay, if they could say that in 1970, we can carry on saying it today. I think it's true. There's not going to be a shift of water from cities and industry and mining to agriculture, but agriculture is certainly going to get a share of what there is available. I think it's important that agriculture keeps track of what's happening elsewhere. And one of the things that agriculture is doing well, and I see this as I drive around the country, is using water very efficiently in agriculture. So, I came back from China about 20 years ago, and I said to people, have you heard about the White Revolution in China? And they said, what's this? They thought I was being political. And I was saying, no, it's the white plastic that you see over the fields in China, because they were very good at micro shade cloth. And of course, now if you drive around many parts of South Africa, you see large expanses of shade cloth. Sure, it's got all sorts of functions. One of its functions is to use water more efficiently, reduce evaporation, optimize the use of water within the agricultural system. And I think agriculture is doing extremely well at demonstrating that it actually is using water efficiently. And I think you need to be careful about talking about use it or lose it as being a bad thing. And people, if you threaten them, they'll use less of it because they're going to use it less efficiently because they'll be worried. If you can show how much money, how many jobs, how much food you get per drop of water, and show that it's going up, it's always improving, and you compare it to the rest of the world, I think you make a very good case for the share of water that goes to agriculture. But always, don't be the lion. Say that you're just using what's left over afterwards, because I think that goes down much easier with people. Lions are very kind of big and powerful. You don't want to sort of threaten people. You want to be the guy who sneaks in and just uses what's left over. And I think that's quite important. One of the issues that I think it just has come up now as well about the institutions that are being set up. And we wrote this legislation 28 years ago. And we thought it would maybe take 5 years to get most of the things in place. So when I hear Greg talking about they're still setting up the last catchment management agencies, it worries me. Because those catchment management agencies are supposed to take the decision-making discussions out of Pretoria, Tshwane. I think we still say Pretoria when we're talking about the capital. But we want to take the decision-making away from that central government and put it down locally, and put it not just with government officials, but with a group of people, the water users, as well as the local governments who are interested, and enable that sort of decision to happen locally. That's why it's important to get these water these catchment management agencies up and running, because they're going to enable a better conversation to happen down at closer to the ground. Now, I get very worried because we're down to 6 water user associations, and I think, how are they going to get the meeting of everybody in the Orange and the Vaal to come together and have this discussion? And I think they're going to have to break it up into separate areas and have separate discussions. But the intention of the legislation was always to enable a wider discussion about where should we be allocating water. And then the last point, which I think is really important, because I want to come back to this use it or lose it. When we wrote the legislation back in the 1990s, the banks were very interested and very worried. They were worried that they were going to lose the security against which they were lending money, the security of knowing that the farmer had land on which the farmer could produce income and pay back the loan. And we had a long discussion. We said, well, how long do you need a guarantee for that the farmer can carry on producing and pay back the loan? And we suggested 20 years. And the bank said, no, we want 50. And we compromised on 40. And the idea was that a right to water, and it isn't a right to water, it's a license to use water, should be long enough to enable a farmer who's borrowed money for production, particularly for perennial crops, for orchards and so on, to plant, harvest, pay back, and still take some profit over time, in the period which they had certainty about water use. So I would always suggest that the greatest security that the farmer has is to use that water well, efficiently is important, and demonstrate that, and ensure that the way that the water is used and the things that water is used for benefit society. So jobs become important, food security becomes important, exports become important. But I mean, this stuff, you do it all the time. You're doing it very well. And I think those stories need to be told, that the way that the water law is happening is to encourage people to use the water well. And this is where this problem of being able to transfer water from one person to another, because now you're saying, water is not something that you use to enable all of these things to happen. Water is just an investment that you've made, and you want to be able to sell it because it's like a stock and a share. You want to be able to sell it. But hold on, water is a national asset. It's a national resource. We can't take the whole country's natural resources and just decide just because you're using it today, you can make some money by giving it to somebody tomorrow. And I think that argument has been had. I'd like to think that it's coming to an end. I'm sure it's not, because every generation is going to have this argument again. But I think we're moving in the right direction. And I'd like to think that the approach of saying water use licenses give agriculture the ability to plan and program and invest with certainty, and at the end of that there's always a rollover period that if they want to carry on they can carry on, and that's all that's in the legislation. And the question is it going to work? I am nervous about all of these people who think that if we don't actually formally get our new license to use water, somehow we're being protected. I think the farmers who are still resisting the transfer from existing lawful use to licensed water are probably going to undermine their own status, because they look as though they're trying to hold on to a property. And the law is now quite clear. Water resources are not a property as such. It's something that you're allowed to use under conditions. You're given certainty to use it, but don't try and hold on to it, and don't make this mistake of trying to turn everything that we have and that we use somehow into a financial instrument, because then you're actually creating a new kind of conflict which is not going to serve you well. So I think the use it or lose it principle is good, and I'd like to think that it encourages people to use water more efficiently and more productively rather than unproductively. But we can have that discussion here.
I think that's a very important point. We touched on it last night by chance, is because my perspective was that I was worried about water licenses and the 5-year renewal term and other conditions to those water licenses. But you explained to me the 40-year principle. Is that in legislation already? And if you can prove that you're using water productively, efficiently, the 5-year renewal is actually fait accompli, if I can say it that. Will it be? Is it or
okay?
Am I oversimplifying it?
Look, I hate to use the banks as a reference point. The banks were worried that if they lent money to a farmer who was using water for his agricultural activities, they wouldn't get the money back. They wanted sufficient certainty that if they lent the money for agriculture to an irrigation farmer, the money would come back. Now, 40 years was also introduced, I think, because the notion was that a really long perennial crop might take that long. And they wanted to be sure, because, the banks want their money back. I mean, are there any bankers in here? I must be careful. But the point is that the principle, and the principle is in the Water Act, saying what criteria do you allocate water on? And one of the criteria is that you've got to be using it, and one of the criteria is you can't take it away if people can show that the economic activity they're undertaking is reasonable and productive and useful. And I think it was written to try and achieve this balance between the desire for people to have certainty and the banks to have certainty, but the recognition that a society in change might change its priorities for water use. And over time, you've got to let that change happen. But over time, not one day to the next. And what worries me is people who resist change are actually inviting someone to come and say, right, you've been resisting for 30 years, now you're forcing us to take action. And I think that would be a very big misstep on both sides. If government does it, it would be a misstep. But if the farmers push government to do it, it would also be a misstep.
Dear, where are we in this process with government?
Yeah, so it's hopefully going to NETLAC. There has been a formal request from organised business that it does go to NETLAC. Parliament obviously will ultimately decide legislative amendments, you know, and that's aspect of it. But you don't get the same opportunity necessary for that interaction with Parliament on a line-by-line basis as you do with NETLAC. So that's very important. And I mean, it maybe wasn't stated sort of expressly, but we're talking about amendments to the National Water Act. It's also important to note that there's regulations around the criteria, etc., for water use licensing. So it's a whole suite of sort of the legislative instrument and then all the subordinate legislation that one needs to discuss. And I think so maybe just on on that point, and maybe Prof, to some of your points. So I think the concept of use it to lose it as a theoretical concept and even as a legislative concept is not necessarily the core of the challenge. I think the core of the challenge is who administers it and who decides whether you're using it efficiently or not. And coupling that with being able to trade water rights, and this is not necessarily in the property sense, but to be able to temporarily reallocate it to another property either owned by yourself or owned by someone else, or conditionally surrendering a part of your license on condition that it can be transferred to someone else. That essentially allows, if you're not able to use it efficiently or your entire allocation efficiently, and that can be for a variety of reasons. It can be that you've got capital constraints, it could be for a number of reasons. Then there is a monetary incentive to actually be able to pass it on to someone who can use it more efficiently. So I don't think it's necessarily contrary to the concept of use it to lose it. I think the challenge that we just have is in the time that what we're seeing with so much of the government regulation is I think we've realized that a sort of a top-down approach hasn't necessarily worked, that we need partnerships between the industry and government. And we're seeing this on the logistics sector, we're opening up rail, for instance, to third parties. We've seen it with the energy crisis, where through the IPP process, bringing in private sector, in a regulated basis, not an unregulated basis, we're achieving efficiencies. And I think maybe one of the concerns we're seeing, and this is something where I do honestly believe that efficient use, everyone's got the same idea and end objective in mind. But I do think, the fear is that if you tighten up the trading side of it and apply the use it to lose it principle, it might be going the other direction to say, almost that we're not going to allow the market or financial incentives to move efficiency. It's going to be a more tightly regulated process where government will decide on efficiency. So I think that's some of the challenges. And it's always a case, and I think this is exactly it with the existing lawful use as well. Logically, existing lawful use has to be a temporary measure. It can never be a permanent, where there's 20, 40 years. Otherwise, we're never going to be able to achieve the constitutional imperatives for transformation that we have to. But you do have a challenge by trying to fix a shortcomings in implementation through tightening up legislation and regulations. And I think with many areas, we've seen a challenge to that, where it doesn't necessarily work. And that's why some of the concepts, for instance, with existing lawful use, we've never fully discussed the concept of a sunset clause, for instance, to say it is temporary under certain conditions, or if you here are the licensing conditions, you have a set period of time. If you can prove or make your investments accordingly, then the likelihood of obtaining a water license would be so much greater. I think that gives a slightly bigger level of certainty. But the concern that we just see at the moment, and again, I think this is maybe where there are some shortcomings in the legislative process to have these direct discussions in terms of what is the intention and the mechanism. Is if you read the mechanism, it does seem in some instances that it might be a bit of a a blunt, prompt ending to existing lawful use, which has to happen at some time. But I think a more negotiated, controlled process moving towards water licenses would make more sense.
Perfect. I want to come to the infrastructure situation and Janse, to you. We've seen your appointment again. Congratulations on that. We know that the National Water Infrastructure Agency has been mooted, and I'm glad to see that there's now sort of development in that field. I don't know how much you can say and not say at this stage, but do you have a sense of the brief or the rationale of what this agency is going to do? If you can, just expand a little bit on that, please.
It's no secret, John. It's the establishment of the agency was the culmination of a legislative process. So Act's been drafted establishing the infrastructure agency. which sets out the obligations, responsibilities, the tasks of it. As an aside, we know that infrastructure maintenance and development has been lagging, if not poor, in the South African context, in particular with respect to municipalities. If we're losing 47.3% of all water through leakages and non-revenue water, if you start talking about competition for water resources, if you can fix some of those leaks, you're taking a lot of the competition element away for beneficial use of water. That is required. So, interestingly, a lot of thought went into the model and the thinking about an infrastructure agency altogether. It used to be back in the day, and Mike would remember, my father was a civil engineer for the Water Department of Water and Sanitation himself for a long time, is that those infrastructure capability and capacity was within the department itself. It's moved away, and I think there's been reasons for it as well, but a lot of it is essentially outsourced, which is not completely different from what it used to be like in the day, but the essence of it is that there needs to be a place where infrastructure of water is parked. Now, we had a resoundingly good model with the Lesotho Highlands Water Project, phase 1 at least, and now going into phase 2 with the Trans-Caledon Tunnel Authority, which is an exceptionally well-governed and managed state-owned entity. And the idea was to duplicate that, but for all the water infrastructure assets that the country has, and that includes all your big dams. The other interesting feature is these dams are all old, and the canal systems are all very old, but they're unencumbered. They're off the balance sheet of government in that sense. So there's also a potential for raising capital through the creation of this infrastructure agency. And this is what Agri-SA, when I was with them, still was very worried about, is that we don't have a very good track record with state-owned entities in South Africa, and those examples are multiple. We have one. Sunroll, I think, was particularly well governed, and a lot of the idea is to make sure that those governance checks, off-balance sheet, ring-fenced financing, with exceptional governance, needs to be in place to ensure that the infrastructure agency is going to be successful. And it's not that yet. It's still very much in the inception. I've been appointed as a board member, so I'm not going to be building canals and dams or anything like that, but I have to look after and make sure that this governance structure is actually going to be working well from a corporate governance point of view. The ideas are sound. I think the possibility of increasing infrastructure spend, which is a crisis, and not as far as building big new projects are concerned. Although there are a whole list of or a list of 11 of such projects. Phase 2 of Lesotho Island project being one of them. In Kumazi River in KwaZulu-Natal, Crocodile River in Molotu. Big things that are going to make big impacts as far as water services delivery is concerned. And increasing that spend, the pipeline, by the way, is something like 106 billion rand just for these 4 big projects at the moment. But the intention is for the infrastructure agency to be able to raise capital, increasing it from 10 billion rand annually to 30 billion rand annually, which is music to the ears of everybody who wants to see that infrastructure being developed and maintained. But again, those governance mechanisms need to be in place, and we mustn't forget about the fact we can't replace failing infrastructure with new infrastructure if we don't have maintenance fully under the thumb to make sure that we don't have a repetition of this this failure, I suppose, in a governance sense, as far as creating the situation where we lose 47.3%.
I think this is so welcome. When you talk of infrastructure and failures of governance, the Guyana project comes to mind, which is a massive failure of billions of rand, which didn't materialize, and nobody really knows where that money went. Exactly. And we've got to get these things right in South Africa, and I'm welcome that you're there. That we start with the governance. Make sure that the governance is right, because then you can build credibility, and the financials will come. And it's good to hear that the projects in the pipeline, in the process already. I wasn't even aware of those. And yeah, good luck with that. It's going to be a good challenge. Greg, before I open to the audience. Anything that we've missed from your side that you want to raise?
I think what I just wanted to add is the important role that collaboration plays. I think we mooted a public-private partnership, so you touched on that. And I think from my perspective, we all are sharing the resources. We need to work together to ensure that that there is enough resources into the future. So from my side, I think when it comes to the infrastructure, I think the important thing to also note is there is other challenges that also needs to be considered: vandalism, theft, operational collapse, and as mentioned by Janse as well, a lot of our infrastructure is quite old. So a lot of our institutions, Water User Association, actually collaborate with the department and manage some of these infrastructure on their behalf. The Valar scheme, quite the biggest scheme in the Southern Hemisphere. Orange Red Canal system. So there's already a sense of collaboration and working together, and I think that's the model we need to take forward. Because if we have, the management at the correct level, so decentralized management, we will go a long way in ensuring that integrated water resource management can take place. Because water, unfortunately, it's not like electricity where you just put it off. It's still going to go somewhere. And if you don't manage it and ensure that the right amounts are flowing at the right place, you could cause quite sufficient damage. So I think, with the infrastructure, there's quite a lot to consider. Not only the O&M of the infrastructure, but also the refurbishment and betterment thereof. So the infrastructure is quite old. And unfortunately, if you don't operate and maintain, you're just deferring costs because you're going to pay more later because you'll have to replace an entire set of infrastructure. So, I think that's it from my side.
I like your point of collaboration and public-private partnerships, etc. I think this is the way the movement in government, even through Operation Vulindlela, etc., is on a cooperative basis. We see it in the rail, we see it in energy generation, etc., etc., and we want to see it in water. But the question then begs, do we have sufficient access to the DG of water, Sean Phillips, and his senior personnel? Is there that collaboration that we need to get into these type of discussions? The earlier you get into these discussions, the better. So can you guys that are working there, can you give me that assurance? Because I think the farmers and the industry would like to know that.
I think if I can give my perspective on that, I think there has been an increase in terms of willingness to collaborate from the department side. I think since the new DG and the previous minister has come in place, there has been a lot more opportunity for having open discussions with them. I know from our organization's point of view, we do engage with the department and at DG level once a quarter. So there is that openness to have a bit of a conversation with them. So I think on that front, there is quite a lot of substantial improvement since the previous regime.
Okay, good to hear. Theo, your experience?
No, certainly, and I think it's also worthwhile maybe just mentioning there's collaboration, but that if there are differences of opinion, for instance, on policy directions, it doesn't necessarily take away from the collaborative efforts. It's just a difference of opinion.
Sure.
On areas where the collaboration is taking place very well, I mean, we've moved just in the last 5-6 years towards a electronic application system for water use licenses, and I think that's a very big positive aspect. There's been good collaboration between organised business, not just agriculture, on some of the problematic water licenses. Some of those that got lost in the system, where there's typos, etc., that the system throws out. There's been very good collaboration there. Also, the financial sector to ensure that these actually do move. It's disappeared a little bit off the radar, but the president made that commitment to the 90-day water license applications a while back. And there's been very good collaborations between business and government to make sure that that actually does take place. So I certainly think we're not in a bad space in terms of that.
Okay, good to hear.
Sure.
Right.
If I may, there's one thing I might add, to the conversation as well, is that, the government is getting its act together belatedly as far as the institutional framework, as far as water governance is concerned, with the creation of CMAs and the final establishment of them, and then the transformation of irrigation boards to water users associations. But there also needs to be a simultaneous shift from both parties' point of view as far as collaboration is concerned, which I think is important and well worth mentioning. Agriculture has been extremely defensive about water allocations. And it has to be said. We can't get away from it. And a person needs to think creatively, and this is the point that why I want to emphasize this particularly, is that if a person comes with data and you come with proposals and you come with solutions, then you find yourself around a table with government. And this is such an important message for all agricultural role players, is that you can't only complain, you can't only accuse, and you can't only destroy, relationships and networks and all these important topics that we talk about. And we're going into a particular phase as far as transformation of the water sector is concerned. We need to make sure that we come on board as far as that simultaneous change between government as well as in the private sector putting up its own hand as far as that is concerned.
Absolutely. I think our motto was always fact-based and evidence-based engagement. There's no other way you can engage if you don't do it on that basis. And I think that should be sort of a mantra for the broader sector and industry to keep doing that. Mike?
Yeah, and I know you want to bring in some people who are online or in the audience, but I think it's important to remind us that there has been this kind of collaboration. I was just kind of racking my brains. The Bivani Dam in KZN, where a big sugar farmer came and said, I want to build a dam, and he was told, fine, you can build a dam, you can expand that 10,000 hectares, but here's the community we want social water for. Here's a couple of other requirements. And, the blader, where people were told that you've got to start using your water more efficiently because your canals are just losing 50% of it. It's not just cities that lose water through leaks. I mean, farmers have been known to lose water through leaky canals as well. And the deal was, okay, we'll build a pipeline. And they built the pipeline, they raised private funding from the Rand Merchant Bank, and then they discovered with this pipeline that came straight from the dam, they didn't have to pump anymore, so they started saving money. And we've got other examples where the mining industry, I think of Limpopo, where the platinum industry is working very closely with the department. Yes, they're fighting all the time, but they are also developing a whole lot of infrastructure that's transforming that area of the Olifants River, assuring water to Polokwane, assuring water to the mines, assuring water to Mozambique, and some farmers get some benefit. And the Kruger Park is happy because when there's a drought, they still have water going through the top of the Kruger Park. So we're seeing this kind of cooperation, but sometimes it's so complicated, it goes over such a long period that people don't even notice it. If you drive down past Steelpoort, the 13th biggest dam in South Africa was built very quietly by the department, not even by private sector. And it's supplying that whole region, and people don't even know about it. And I think this is one of the challenges we have in water. It's a complicated area. Lots of different things happen in different places, and sometimes we lose sight that there actually is real progress being made. We just don't hear about it. Yeah. So welcome this opportunity to talk about some of the things that are happening, not just for the future, but are actually happening and working now.
Yeah, it's not all doom and gloom, definitely not.
Please.
In fact, there's been a lot of progress coming out of the acts, the policy, National Water Resource Strategy. I see there's a master plan. I don't know what its status is at the moment, but sure, those conversations are taking place. Right, we've got about 9 minutes left, and I want to open up for discussion or questions from the floor. Are there any questions that you would like to raise? Did we cover it all? I see the heads nodding. Right, I was actually expecting a few questions on such a contentious subject, but let's come back to the panel. Is there anything that we're missing, that we feel? You must remember this is not just for this audience here. It gets rebroadcast, it gets video, YouTubed and sent out to various positions. What is there that we've missed in our conversation, in our debate, that we need to convey out to the public, to the broader agricultural sector, but also to the wider South African society, in terms of our contribution to the economy, etc., etc. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, John. Just I think one point to mention, especially since we're talking about collaboration, we also. The premise, I think, in the beginning was competing between economic sectors, competition for water. But there's also a great amount of collaboration between economic sectors when it comes to efficient use of water. And here, one I just want to highlight is the potential, and I know it's happening. Again, one of these sort of good news stories that maybe isn't told enough, but of between mining and agriculture, for instance. I know a lot of the water might not be suitable for food production, but for fiber production, for biofuels production, many of the mines, especially those in the Highveld, they've got the challenge of excess water that they need to pump out, they need to get rid of. So I think, again, moving sort of water is a scarce resource, but we also mustn't be trapped in the scarcity mindset to think that's going to drive us towards competition. If we do broaden our horizons a bit, there are immense opportunities that we can also take advantage of.
Mike, I want to come back to the issue that we perhaps started with climate change and extreme water events and either floods or drought. Are we seeing a manifestation of climate change in the weather phenomena that we're starting to experience?
You know, you just showed us. You said there was a meter, 1,000 millimeters of water fell in one night. I think that it's interesting because when we first started talking about climate change, 20 or 30 years ago, people were saying there's going to be water scarcity, there's going to be drought, and what they were missing is that as the atmosphere and the earth warms, more and more water is held in the atmosphere, which is kind of nice because it means, well, there's a potential for having more rain. What they didn't tell us is that if we have more rain, it might fall all at once. And that's actually one of the real threats that we are seeing, is that we don't have to worry quite so much about the average rainfall. It's probably going to go up. What we do have to worry about is quite how it comes and then what happens afterwards. So the intense rainfall, we've been warned about, and we're seeing all over the world, by the way. There are new records being broken all over. But the other side, and I think someone mentioned, South Africa is a semi-arid country, and aridity is about how much water you lose of the water that falls. And South Africa is a very arid country in that only about 6 or 7% of the water that falls as rain ends up getting into the rivers or underground. So the challenge is, as the temperatures get hotter, we're probably going to evaporate more. And unless we think very carefully about how we capture water and then use it, we might find that although there's more water coming when it rains on those 2 days, on the 2 years when it doesn't rain, we lose a huge amount through evaporation and that aridity. And managing aridity during those dry periods to take the benefit of what happens during those very wet periods is going to be one of the big challenges. And I think it is one of the challenges that organized commercial agriculture can apply the science to, and also apply the capital to be able to try and manage this increased variability that we're seeing and increased intensity of events. So climate change is happening, and we are, I think, beginning to manage it. But unfortunately, we tend to always look at the event after that it happens and says, we've got to do it better. And I think it was the eThekwini floods, to talk about water services, where there was this huge destruction around Durban and lots of things got washed away, and people said, oh, this is climate change. And it wasn't. It was a kind of storm that comes to eThekwini every sort of 30 or 40 years. What had changed was the hills around what used to be Durban used to be nice grasslands and very well vegetated, and now are covered with human habitation, and water runs off roofs much quicker than it runs off grassland. And what happened is you had this usual intense storm, but it came with much more runoff as a result of all the development that happened around it. And if you don't manage your drainage systems, it's very boring municipal management. You don't manage your drainage system and your roads and how they are maintained. If that gutter gets blocked and there's a big storm, don't be surprised when you wake up the next morning and you don't have a road anymore. It'll just wash away. And I think we're going to have to improve our maintenance, and this is very much on the municipal side, but I think agriculture, as you've just seen in the Western Cape, also is going to have to get used to much more extreme events and thinking about, when it rains that much, what are we going to do with the water, as opposed to just worrying about what we're going to do when it rains too little. And I think that is beginning to really bite into people's consciousness, as it must.
Yeah, and with that will go the investment into infrastructure, both from a local or industry level even and to a national level. So very valid point. Right, I see we still have two minutes left, but if there are no further points that you would like to raise, then I'm going to say thanks very much to our esteemed panel. I think we elucidated all the points very well. I think there's a clear and common understanding of the issues at hand. And thanks for all the work that all of you do in the water environment for the industry and for South Africa in that regard. I'm really proud of the agricultural industry and what they are achieving despite many headwinds and doing exceptionally well, trying to use water more efficiently. But there are also challenges that we need to help and guide and lead with in terms of how to manage the events that are perhaps coming in all probability. Right, to our audience, thanks very much for attending. I hope that you've learnt a lot in terms of the water environment, where we're moving to, and what's important about water management in South Africa. I also want to say online, thank you very much for those that have attended, that have been watching. It is being streamed live. Thank you for your participation, even though you're not with us here. And then just to close, we're going to have a QR code on the screens, and I want you with your phones just to take a photo of that QR code, because we are being vetted in terms of our performance here today. Was this useful? Did you learn a lot? Is this the type of subject that you are interested in? So please do the survey so that we can improve our nation in conversation topics, discussions, and if there are suggestions, also put those in the survey, please. Your participation in this is very important to us to improve our product. So thank you very much for also being here. And then again to the panel, thanks very, very much. Really a positive discussion. I really enjoyed all the input, and happy to see how things are developing, in what direction they are developing, and that we've got the right people to engage with government on these issues and to form that collaboration with government to get the end product right to the benefit of all South Africans and also the industry. So thanks very much, and then we adjourn. Thank you.